Okay, hi everyone. If we have not met before, my name is Sydney Kraviak and I'm the Program and Outreach Coordinator here at the Peters Township Public Library. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I'm going to hand it over to Linda from the Peters Township Public Library Foundation. And they pay for our Zoom subscription and provide a lot of funding. So she's going to talk to you a little bit about what they do.
Thank you, Sydney. Good evening, everyone. I am Linda Lavinka, and I'm pleased to be here as a member of the Peters Township Library Foundation Board. The foundation is a group of 11 volunteers dedicated to supporting the Peters Township Library, both financially and through volunteer support, as we open books, doors, and minds in our community. We augment the library's budget by providing funding for many of the library offerings. Some of the ways that we support the library is by funding the Peters Township History Room Archivist. And if you haven't visited her, it's so very interesting. We also finance the enhanced version of Zoom for virtual programming just like this. We sponsored the outdoor picnic tables and tents so the library can hold in-person events during warm weather months. And coming up in November is our annual Novel November event. This year's event is on the 3rd, and our author is Andy Weir. He's the best-selling author of The Martian, Artemis, and Project Hail Mary. The Martian was made into a movie with Matt Damon, and Project Hail Mary will be starring Ryan Gosling and should be out next year. So these are a few of our projects. To do these, though, we rely on donations. There's many ways you can donate. You can go to the library website and click on the donate button. In September, we have the Washington County Community Foundation Day of Giving. You can donate on that day. And we did just send out an annual donor mailer. If you haven't donated yet, there's still time. Please send in your check or go to the red donate button. We also raise funds through our used book sale. So if you haven't been into the library, please come in. We have a lot of terrific books in the rotunda, and we have them year long. I thank you for your valued support, and we will continue to help augment the library budget to provide programming and materials that you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And before I hand it over to our speaker, just a reminder, we are going to have time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions that pop up in your head, feel free to type them into the chat. I do ask that you leave your camera and microphones turned off for now, just that way we can all focus on Chris's presentation this evening. So Chris is from the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania, and he's going to be talking to us this evening about some local birds that we can see outside. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening, Chris.
Thank you, Sydney, very much. And thank you, Linda, for everything you guys do. And I am here as a result and big supporter of local libraries myself. So hopefully you all will want to support your local library here. So yes, my name is Chris Kubiak. I'm the Director of Education at the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania. We are actually one of the oldest and largest Audubon societies in the United States, going back to 1916. And you can see our mission there. It's connecting people of southwestern Pennsylvania to birds and nature. And we do that in 3 different ways. We do that through our programs, like I'm doing tonight. We do roughly around 800 public programs, both formal and informal, every single year, as well as our projects. You can see one of my favorite birds there in the middle. Those are chimney swifts. If we have enough time tonight, I can talk about them a little bit. We've been working in building faux wooden chimneys to help this declining insect eater that we have in our area. And then lastly, our places. We have 3 full-time nature reserves that you can go visit, as well as actually 3 centers. And we opened a new one in Buffalo Creek Nature Park down in Buffalo Township or Starver, Pennsylvania. So I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite subjects, obviously birds, and some of the different species that you can find here in Western Pennsylvania. Now it's interesting, again, obviously you guys are spending a Monday evening here with us and me in particular, so you clearly have some interest in birds. And I'm gonna tell you that right now is probably the most interesting time of the year to get out and observe birds. And I'm not quite sure how many of you know this, but as you've been sleeping the last, say, month and a half, every single night, there is literally a river of birds that are passing over your head using the stars or the moon or Earth's magnetic field to navigate to where they're going to end up hanging out all summer and breeding and then returning south for the winter. So this is the peak period of our migration. At all times throughout the year, there's an ebb and flow of birds, but we are definitely in the flow period of time where we're just getting inundated with a whole host of different really amazing species. Now, when I'm getting into looking at some of these species, I'm going to talk about some of their ecology and life history. Some of them I'm sure you're going to be very familiar with. Some I imagine you will not be, but I do want to talk about some of these species and how you can identify them and some of the unique aspects to them, right? So I think most people could probably identify this particular bird and bird species. Certainly, this is your northern cardinal, a very ubiquitous bird that you can find here in not only Washington County, but western Pennsylvania and really throughout the eastern part of North America. Interestingly enough, if you go back in time, roughly about 150 to 200 years ago, cardinals would have been relatively uncommon in our region. And that's because this is one of several bird species that have really benefited from human beings changing our local ecosystems to what they were prior to European and then later folks from across the world settlement in our region, right? So historically, we were mostly a mass of a forest. And so this bird really likes sort of forest edges and sort of second growth and suburban type habitats. So cardinals obviously are very, very common. This bird, and I'm going to talk about some of these other species, has what we call sexual dimorphism, which is a really fancy way of saying essentially that males and females are different in some distinguishable way. So with songbirds, or the other term that we use for them are called passerines, you often see the males are the brightly colored ones, right? They have these bright colors, where the females are not. They're much drabber. They actually do not look nearly as colorful, if colorful at all, as the males. And that is what we call sexual dimorphism. In the bird of prey world, if you ever watch our bald eagle camera at Hayes, a lot of birds in the bird of prey world show sexual dimorphism, but mostly based on size. So bald eagles are sexually dimorphic, not in their plumage, but on their size. So females are actually larger than the males. So that's one way to determine that here. And you can see here is the female cardinal. Both have those plumes that they use as a signal to both each other and other birds right now. And we are literally in the peak of cardinal breeding season. So I get a lot of phone calls at Audubon asking about why that cardinal is attacking their window or car window or mirror. And it's almost always the male. And that's because right now, as I say, love is in the air, right? Testosterone is flowing. And so those males view their reflection as another rival male. But this happens very frequently in a very common local bird. And you can see, again, a very widely distributed bird that has really, really benefited from human alteration of our ecosystems. And again, from all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula into parts of New Mexico to Maine and New Brunswick. So a widely distributed bird. A bird that is not sexually dimorphic, a non-sexual dimorphic bird, is our blue jay, right? Now, interestingly, to me at least, that lots of people really don't like this bird. I find that very fascinating. They say blue jays are loud, right? Blue jays are kind of mean birds or jerk birds, as I hear. And of course, that's a very human perspective on these birds. But I will tell you, if you spend enough time watching blue jays, and more importantly, listening to blue jays are highly intelligent birds. In fact, substantially more intelligent than most bird species that we can find in our area. In fact, you often will hear, right, the wise old owl. People have this perception that our owls, great horned and screech and barred and barn owls, are very intelligent. And actually, that's not true at all, because I work with some of these live birds. They are not very intelligent. But this particular species is. Now, blue jays are part of a larger family of birds that are known as the corvids or corvidae. So blue jays and other jays, if you go out west, there's Steller jays, and up north, gray jays or Canada jays. They're in this larger family of Corvidae that includes ravens, crows, and magpies. All incredibly intelligent. We'll talk a little bit more as we move in here about some of these birds that you can find in our area, and including blue jays, have what you could distinguish as a rudimentary language, right? You are hopefully understanding my words here tonight. Blue jays use a substantial number of sounds and calls and various noises to communicate certain information to each other. In fact, I like to say blue jays are is nature's first alert, right? So if there's a predator around, like a cat or a hawk, it's usually blue jays that are going to alert, the rest of the birds first in that loud jay call. They are also very good at mimicking, particularly hawks. So this particular bird often will mimic either red-shouldered or broad-winged hawks. And we still don't know exactly why they do it. There's some guesses, probably to maximize food sources. But I often think, and I mean this sincerely, sometimes I think it's just they like to do it just to mess with other birds, right? But highly intelligent birds. My background is not in ornithology. This was something that I was always interested in, and now I do it as a career. But my background is actually in early American history, and I studied the Native Americans and their cultures up to the American Revolution, but specifically the French and Indian War. And I have found historical documents where the Native Americans talk about why they were so successful at finding Europeans, later Americans in the woods, was by listening to the blue jays and understanding what they were telling each other. So next time you see them either at your feeders or yards and you hear them yelling jay really loud, they may be talking about you, right? So really interesting, fascinating bird. And again, another bird that is really widely distributed from Florida to Newfoundland all the way into the edge of the Rocky Mountains. So one I'm sure that you are all familiar with. Here's another bird that actually, again, would not have been super common prior to European settlement, but now is very, very common. This is your American crow, right? And American crows are a bird that likes open areas or, mixture between forest and farms and suburban areas. And there's probably more crows now in Western Pennsylvania than there's ever been at any time in their history. Again, because we've created such perfect habitat for these particular birds. Now, again, these are in the Corvidae family, like blue jays. They are very, very intelligent. And unlike most bird species, and we think this is the case with blue jays, but we know in the case of crows can discern not only individual human faces, but individual crow faces, that they can discriminate between each other as individuals. Very social birds, very protective of their larger clan group or family group. You will often see them attacking hawks or sometimes owls. And so blue jays will call them in to be the bigger cousins to drive them out. But very, very smart birds. They have also been shown to not only use tools, but to pass information down through generations to their offspring and then going, further down the line. And one perfect case of this is what we call the urban crow phenomenon. Every single year, starting in November, thousands upon thousands of crows stream into urban areas across eastern part of the United States, and Pittsburgh included, where you can get as many as 30 to 40,000 crows hanging out there. They've taught generations, their offspring and generations after that cities are safer for them. They're warmer in the winter and there's lots of food around. So really smart, intelligent bird. And again, a relatively easy bird to identify based on that black, right? And as you hear that famous saying, as the crow flies, right? Crows, when they fly, are usually going to be flying in a straight line. And we're going to see here in a little bit. Another widely distributed bird, thanks to humans really changing and altering the environment. But this guy, this is the supreme corvid, the most intelligent out of all of the family of Corvidae. This is your common raven. So a bird that not that long ago was not very common in Western Pennsylvania but has been returning in our area, including Washington County, in really large numbers. Historically, this is a bird in Western PA that would have been our most common corvid other than blue jays. You would find them in forested areas. And then once our forests were cut down and they were shot, they kind of moved out. But they have moved back in large numbers, and just an amazingly intelligent bird. They've done studies on ravens that show that they're probably nature's most intelligent bird avian species, even more so than some of the parrots. And these guys, they claim, have an intelligence of a 14-year-old human child. And I can vouch for that because we used to have an education raven that we would work with. That bird was just amazing at the different problem solving that it could do. There was a famous test what we'd like to do with it, and we didn't develop it, but you would put its favorite food in a little beaker with a little bit of water and couldn't get its beak all the way in to grab it. It learned over time if it put rocks in there to raise the volume up of that water, it could grab its treat. So very, very good at abstract thinking and problem solving. Just a really, really fascinating bird. Ravens, again, they hold their wings slightly different than crows. They've got a much thicker beak that you could see there. And their tail looks more like a little bit of rounded or almost like a paddle shape compared to a crow. And they're about a third larger than crows are. They're substantially bigger. And again, you can see here, I'm going to have to change this a little bit and extend the range further west in Western PA, but they have really rebounded here. And people ask me all the time, how can I determine here in our area, because now we're starting to get both of them together, how can I figure out which is which, right? Well, you can see some things here when you're looking at this identification, and that's one of the things that I really teach at Audubon is bird ID, whether it's through plumage or behavior or through sound. You're going to look for certain impressions that these birds give you, right? Just like if you saw your Aunt Sally or Uncle Tom, they give certain impressions other than just their face, right? That you can figure out who that is. Well, birds, it's the same thing when you're doing this with different bird species, right? So you can see their crows have relatively straight beaks. They're generally smaller, where common ravens are larger. They have a slight point, much bigger beak. Crows will do these rhythmic caws with smooth neck feathers, while you hear this croak sound out of the raven with those sort of shaggy neck feathers. And even way they fly is very distinctive, right? As I mentioned, and we're going to see in this next slide here, like that saying, for a good reason, like the crow flies, crows fly straight, right? They are constantly moving in a single direction. If you watch a raven, though, it will fly lazily and go into circles, moving about like it's having a good time, it's enjoying in life, right? You know, they're having fun. And so it's easy that when you see from a distance where it's hard to judge their size, I use their body posture and their flight to use as a ID. So really pay attention to any larger blackbirds you're starting to see, because these ravens are definitely making a big comeback. A really, really very common, I should say, bird in Western Pennsylvania, though down your way, this particular species has been replaced over the last, say, 25 to 30 years. This is a black-capped chickadee. Now, you may still get them down your way in wintertime, but most of the birds, we'll see the next one that you have, is no longer this species, right? And these guys, blackcaps, I am coming from Butler, Pennsylvania today. I am actually in the blackcaps range that we're not sure for how long because they're being displaced. But blackcaps are a little bit larger than their very closely related cousins, the Carolina chickadees. The blackcaps are also show, if you can see in their wings, they're a very strong white coloration on their feathers, on what's called their secondaries and their primaries, which are these longer feathers that come out there. And you will see, again, different, right? So when I'm doing this identification, right, and I know where you guys live, mostly just by geography, you're going to have Carolina chickadees, but blackcaps will have this white nape that you see on the side of their heads with that black cap and black throat. but these bold white edges on what we call the secondary feathers. See how that white really contrasts very boldly against sort of the charcoal gray is a dead giveaway. And yes, you can teach chickadees, if you're patient, to come to your hand, land on your hand and find seeds, which is, I think, a really fun thing to do. Okay, and again, a more northern species that is rapidly being replaced in Western Pennsylvania by its southern cousin, the Carolina chickadee. Now, you have, like I said, other than winter in Washington County and south of where my home office is in Fox Chapel, they are all Carolina chickadees. Carolina chickadees and blackcaps have a narrow band in which they hybridize, so they intermate, and you get hybrids between the two. There is no geographic limitation between these two species. It is a minimum winter temperature. So Carolinas have they have a much higher mortality when it gets below certain temperatures, where blackcaps have evolved to survive that. So with climate change, we're seeing a rapid retreat of the blackcaps in these Carolinas moving into their areas. So it's funny, if you study birds, you study bird populations and the impacts of climate change, you can really see a lot of birds moving as a result for warming climate. And it does not take very much to really alter some of our local bird populations. So here, like I said, you can see these Carolinas there. Carolinas have these gray napes. They're much grayer on the side, not nearly as bold white. And they don't have the bold white edges on their secondary. It's much sort of drabber, right? And so you can see it's not as contrasting on that particular bird. But again, and they're also smaller. But again, where you guys live, I just know this from a geographic standpoint, you can be very confident that you have Carolina chickadees rather than blackcaps. The other way to determine that, and this takes more skill, and hopefully you have some interest over time, is using bird song to identify a bird, right? Carolinas will do a 4-part song. It sounds like Phoebe, Phoebe, where the blackcaps say, hey, sweetie, hey, sweetie. So they do a 2-part song. So when I'm teaching bird song and trying to use bird song to identify what species it is, I often will use mnemonics like I just gave you, right? Like in my mind's eye, I hear the blackcap say, hey, sweetie, right? You do this with Roy G. Bibb for The Color of the Rainbow, right? So just a way to help remember what these songs and these calls are to help you identify that bird. Here, this is showing, again, that range is divided between both blackcaps and Carolinas. And I need to pull this, and when I'm redesigning this map, this is probably from a couple of years ago, it is happening at such a rapid rate that I need to update this more, because it doesn't even look like it's over Washington County and Allegheny County now, but it is, and it's happening very fast. There's this narrow band that you see here in green. That is the hybrid zone between those two species. So again, it has always existed. 200 years ago, you would have found it down below Kentucky, along the Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina border. But with climate change, as things warm, particularly in our winters, this range is shifting further and further north. So let's talk about some of my favorite birds. I mean, again, if you know me, this is kind of a running joke because all birds are my favorite to some degrees, but I really love the warblers. Warbler birding is one of the most difficult birding of all species that you're going to find in our area. In fact, right now, if you count all of the waterfowl and shorebirds and warblers and other migrants, passage migrants, you can find in Pennsylvania, if you have a lot of time, right, because you're going to have to travel a few different places, but you could find roughly 300 species of birds right now in Pennsylvania. And this bird that you see here, a yellow warbler, is a very, very common warbler of its kind. In fact, probably one of the most common that we have breeding in our area. This is a male yellow warbler. Like the name suggests, they're all yellow, but the males will have this orange streakiness, almost like a necklace coming down from their throat and sort of bleeding off to the edges of their flanks. They love wet areas. So along streams with willows or wet fields or wet thickets, this bird is very, very common, and it's easy to see once, or at least before these leave, we get full leaf out. One of the most common songs that I hear when I'm doing bird surveys or doing bird outings, where you hear that sweet, sweet, sweeter and sweet is the song. But it's cool that these birds and these next few warblers that I'm going to show you are birds that are coming from vast distances to come here to Western Pennsylvania. In fact, our yellow warblers that we have breeding here in Western PA, a number of them are coming from anywhere from Mexico to northern South America to potentially in the Caribbean Sea. They had found a yellow warbler that was banded up near Erie on Presque Isle that returned 9 years straight. And they estimated that the distance that that bird had migrated, and I can't remember how they figured this out, but pretty sure it had gone to Venezuela and spent the winter in Venezuela. But the amount of times it had migrated between, Venezuela and Erie and back and forth was like going around planet Earth at least once. All right. So these birds are amazing long distance flyers, and they are known as what's called nocturnal migrants. So most of our migrating birds, whether they be warblers or a number of other species, flycatchers, the tanagers, the grosbeaks, the buntings, are migrating at night. So they're using the stars to navigate and also reading Earth's magnetic field, which we can't even imagine, right? We don't have those senses. So I'm amazed by that some of these birds arrive at their breeding grounds literally to the day that they did the year before, coming vast distances, right? Now, I don't know about you, but I'm one of those people that I'm always misplacing my shoes and my keys. So I'm amazed that these birds can find their way from place to place. So this is a male yellow warbler. Here is another long distant migrant. Now, this bird is not going to be a bird that you're going to find breeding here in Western Pennsylvania, but you will be seeing this bird coming through actually right now as its peak through Western Pennsylvania as it's moving north to the boreal forests of Canada to breed. So this bird breeds in all those pine trees up north in Canada and northern New England. This is a bay-breasted warbler. So a bird that is a pine specialist in Canada. It eats a lot of the insects that are up there in their summer. And a bird that, interestingly enough, has a very sort of unique plumage, you can see here, that is very different in the fall than what it is right now. So come August, this bird will lose all that coloration and look very, very different. So maybe in the future, right, I can do a program on fall warblers, but looks very different because, and I'm sure you all know this here, right? It's the females that hold the key to, males and all of our behavior, particularly in the case with plumage, right? Females are judging this male's fitness based on his plumage, as well as a few other keys as well, but just a really gorgeous looking bird. I was out birding on Sunday and found a number of these birds moving through. So we're very close to the statistical peak of migration. Another one of my famous, just really beautifully plumaged bird here. This is a male breeding Magnolia Warbler. Also a bird that does not breed here in Western Pennsylvania, but is a passage migrant. It moves through. And a bird that also is breeding up in those massive pine forests from Newfoundland over to Alaska. This bird has nothing to do with magnolias whatsoever. And unfortunately, a lot of our birds, particularly warblers, have unfortunate names that they were named early on after the first place that a ornithologist or scientist had discovered it. And that was the case of this bird. And Audubon found it in a magnolia tree in migration down in Louisiana and thought that it had some association with it, but it does not. It has zero association with magnolias. It actually should probably be called the spruce warbler because it really likes a lot of spruces, right? But a very boldly patterned bird. You can see again with that sort of yellow throat going down its chest, and then that black streaking. And you could see contrast with the white wings and sort of that bandit look on its face. These birds, again, are brightly plumaged. This is a male. Females look very different from this. And another bird that is pretty common in our area during migration. So if you want to see this, now's the time to get out there. But I will tell you, they are some of the hardest birds to identify, because it's like someone gave them 2 espressos on top of a couple, chocolate bars and some other things to really make them. They are like super, super hyper birds, moving from branch to branch, rarely staying still, because they're trying to feed up and refuel to make their migration passage further north. Lastly, of the warblers here, and these are our spring warblers, right? A lot of these birds lose that plumage to the males. This bird is a cerulean warbler, a warbler that has declined 99% in its range since the 1960s. In fact, a bird that probably, all things being equal, should be listed on the Endangered Species Act, though it is not. And its decline is very complicated. It's losing breeding habitat here, where it breeds in both Western Pennsylvania and other places in the east, but also in its wintering grounds, which is the foothills of the Andes Mountains in Peru and Ecuador and Colombia, where a lot of the forest that they need has been cleared for cattle farming or coffee and chocolate plantations. So it's very complex, but just an absolutely stunning, bright cerulean blue bird that this picture does not do it justice when you find it. And I still know of places. I found a breeding pair that I've been sort of keeping tabs on for the last few years in Moraine State Park. There are a number of places down in Washington County where they breed. They love old, mature trees, particularly tulip trees along small creeks. And again, a lot of that type of habitat has been cleared either through development or farming. So we've lost a lot of that, but just a really gorgeous bird. And it's interesting too, they are up high in the canopy of these really tall trees. And when the male and female are sitting on the nest to confuse predators that are watching for birds going in and out of nests so they can raid the nest, they've developed and evolved a really interesting strategy where when they're sitting on the nest, they'll actually fall out of the nest in free fall about 20 feet before they actually fly. So that makes it difficult for a predator to get a bead on where their nest is. And as you can probably tell, if you have a robin's nest or anything around you, right, the nests often get raided. In fact, we think about half nests of all bird species are probably raided by predators of some type. So either other birds like blue jays or crows, but also raccoons, squirrels and chipmunks also eat eggs, snakes. So some of these birds have really interesting strategies to deal with that. So getting in, so some of the less sort of far long distant migrants and a little more what we call resident species are birds like this, right? This is a tufted titmouse. Again, another non-sexually dimorphic bird. You can see the small gray sort of peaks in their plumage there with the sort of bay wash on their side. A very common bird that we have around here. You can see, again, one sitting on a feeder there. If you feed birds, you're almost certainly going to find this particular species at your feeders, but very, very common. And also a relatively new arrival in Western PA. So these birds, again, like the cardinals, were not very common, if at all, prior to the 1850s. So we've created the perfect habitat for them to be able to expand into our area. You can see we are right on the northern end of their range. So combination of changes in habitat as well as climate changes really force these birds to move north. I love these birds. This is another common resident species that is known as a white-breasted nuthatch. And nuthatches, you can see this particular guy, are designed essentially to be trunk and limb specialists. So they are able to hang on to the trunks of trees by the bark with very unique feet. And they will often creep head first down the trunks and often in circles around the trees, looking within the crevices of that trees for insects. But their other thing that they often do when they're coming to your feeders is taking those seeds and caching them or hiding them for a future time, right, when there's less resources. So I often find, and I know, like I said, I work at Beechwood Farms in Fox Chapel where our headquarters are. We feed, of course, the birds there. And I have found several times sunflowers sprouting out of the side of our barn that this bird, right, cached those seeds there. You can see their bills have a really slight upturn at the end there, so they can kind of put them in the crevices and, of course, hide or remove seeds. And here's a good example of that right here. All right, so and they have a really funny call that's very unique. It's sort of like a squeaky toy as they're going up and down the trunks of trees. But again, this is a white-breasted nuthatch. And a bird also widely distributed, but also one that is very common in Western Pennsylvania. Our most common, we'll get into some woodpeckers here. This is your Downy woodpecker. This is a male. When you see the red behind their head, that designates a male. Downies, for every 10 woodpeckers in Western Pennsylvania, I'd say probably 5 of them are Downies. Very, very common. Common feeder. This is a female. You can see identifying them. We're going to see the hairy woodpecker next. Their bills are much shorter, and the feathers often come up halfway of the bill. You can see here, this is a female because she is lacking the red spot on the back of her head. And Downies love to come to suet and feeders as well, so you may want to feed them. But probably North America's most common and abundant woodpecker. And here is your hairy. It's hard to tell in these pictures here, but hairies look very, very similar to Downies, but they are larger, often twice as large as a Downy. And their bills are much longer and thicker than you'd find with a Downy as well. So you can kind of see here. This is a female, right? And you look again, once again, that bill is much, much bigger, much, much thicker than your Downy woodpecker, right? Another widely distributed bird, but again, not very common compared to your Downy. So if you're seeing a bird that looks like that at your feeder in your yard or you're at a park, most likely it's going to be a Downy. This gives you a good example. Rarely do you ever see these two birds together like this, but this is a great one that shows you the size difference between a Downy woodpecker that you see there on the left, right, are more common, and then are less common, the hairy woodpecker on the right. While they look almost exactly alike, interestingly enough, they are not closely related. So this is what in evolution we call convergent evolution. That pattern, for whatever reason, evolved on these two totally distinctive birds because it blended in better and predators could not eat them. So, but this is a really great example of what these two birds from a size standpoint in their bills look like. You can see here the male Downy is on the left. You can see that straight line where male hairies on the right also have red, but there's a black plumage that just sort of separates that. So another way to use to identify this particular bird. These guys are great. And these are another woodpecker species that is becoming more and more common in Western Pennsylvania. They've risen by almost 400%, I'd say, since the 1970s. This is a northern flicker, but our subspecies here in the East, we call them yellow-shafted flickers, right? And look at all, that's a busy looking bird there, right? You can see sort of the half moon gorget, the black, contrasted with sort of that tawny color going up to the black mustache. You can see all the spotting on its chest and then the yellow in its tail. The spotting is on this bird because they spend a substantial amount of time on the ground compared to most other woodpeckers. In fact, right now, actually, I often will see them in my yard going after worms and also ants. So they're a bird that really likes, particularly for a woodpecker, spend a lot of time on the ground, right? Here's another look at a bird. Again, all that pattern, again, on the ground there that you can see. Okay, this is a young flicker there. Here's why they're called yellow-shafted. The ones you can find here in the east of the Rocky Mountains. You can see all that yellow coloring, which one of the colloquial names for this bird is the yellowhammer. right? Because it is a woodpecker that, again, hammers its bill into the trees, but it's got that yellow on it. If you go west of the Rocky Mountains, so in Washington State or Portland or parts of Colorado in California, you also get a northern flicker, but their species there is the red shafted. So instead of being yellow, they've got the red coloration underneath their wings there, replacing that. And here you go. So you can see the red shafted on the left, the yellow shafted on the right, which we are in certainly, and then that little bit of a hybrid zone there in the Rocky Mountains where you see the purple there. So pretty cool. Another bird that often is, again, the woodpecker family, very common, but confused with a red-headed woodpecker. This is a red-bellied woodpecker. I often say a really misnamed bird in a lot of ways because, again, do you see the red belly on this? I don't either, right? This is a male because males will have that full red mohawk with that zebra pattern in the back, where females, and you'll see here in a second, have a sort of a bald spot. It's gray in between there. This is another bird that 50 or 60 years ago was incredibly rare in Western Pennsylvania, but because of our warming temperatures, has rapidly increased in our region. And it's good reason why we study bird populations and monitor this, because again, as our temperatures change, as they warm, avian fauna, so these populations are shifting as a result. And these birds, it's funny, I have all these records at Audubon from the 1950s and 60s when people were seeing them in Washington County and Allegheny County. They were excited. This was a rare bird, right? Now it is a very common and ubiquitous bird that we can find here. In fact, right before you guys started, I'm sitting here in my room, and I was listening to one right outside my window in the trees where it has a nest. So, and you can see there's the female on the bottom right there, that little bald spot, where the male's on the top left. So another very common woodpecker species, right? You can see, again, rapidly moving north as the climate warms, particularly in our winters. Our largest woodpecker species that we have, this is your pileated or pileated. You can use either term to distinguish. This is a crow-sized woodpecker. And this is one serious woodpecker. You can see that hole that it put into that tree there, right? This particular bird is a carpenter ant specialist. So it loves to eat carpenter ants, particularly carpenter ant larvae, but it will eat the adults. And I always feel bad when people call me at Audubon and say, I've got one of these birds ripping up holes in the side of my wood siding. What do I do? And I say, well, you've got two problems. Not only do you have a pileated ripping holes, but that means you've got really bad infestation of carpenter ants in your wooded siding, and they will find that. So this is a large bird. This is what Woody Woodpecker was based on. If you remember that, I'm probably showing my age here. But Woody Woodpecker was based on the pileated, a bird that has come back in huge numbers compared to what they were even 40 years ago because our forests are returning. They need large, mature trees. And this is a male there. You see the males will have a red mustache coming out from the lower bill, where females just have the black mustache that you see there, right? And they're also really fascinating birds in the extent that they use so much force from their bill when they're opening up these holes. They're like jackhammers, that they give their brains CTE. So if you're familiar with that term, you often hear with athletes, particularly football players, that damage their brain from constant, hitting and in contact from their brain and their skull. What's fascinating about these birds, though, is that they are able to heal that. Their brain is able to recover from the CTE and grow new brain cells. So I know the University of Pittsburgh, my alma mater, is actually working in their medical field. They've got a real big area where they focus on concussion research. They're actually working on how these birds are actually able to do that and see if there's any therapeutic ideas or things that they can use that with humans, obviously, right? Because the CTE is really bad. Again, very large bird. When you see them fly, you can see those white markings underneath their wings. And they have very shallow and deep or excuse me, going from shallow to then very deep wing beats as they're flying. And look, it's kind of hard to believe a bird shaped like that is actually as good as a flyer it is. Again, another bird that you can see stretching in areas that are forested, so from California, but particularly in the east, where historically we had almost all mature forests. Okay. Another bird with Carolina in its name. This is a Carolina wren, a bird that also, like the name suggests, was first described in the Carolinas, but has extended its range to our areas. The climate's warmed. And one of our earliest breeders, they will often start laying eggs, and if it's warm enough, late February into March. I always say you want to get these birds nesting in your house, put out a hanging basket or wreath on your door. They almost always will build a nest. It's amazing how often they get that and do that. So you can see again their range here. We're right at the northern part of it. Okay. I would be willing to bet that just about every person in this program tonight could identify this bird, right? This is your American robin. This is a male, probably our most common bird, one of our most common suburban and urban birds. A bird, though, that 200 plus years ago was not common in Western PA. This was a relatively rare bird, but again, we have created the perfect habitat for these birds to thrive. They love a sort of a suburban setting with lots of grass. Here's the female there. I often ask people, I say, what do robins eat year round? People almost always say worms, right? That's not true. Robins are in the thrush family. They are thrushes, so related to wood thrushes and hermit thrushes, and there's tropical thrush species. They are primarily fruit eaters. So if you grow fruit like blueberries or cherries or raspberries, these birds will often be the ones that will eat the fruit that you're trying to grow first. They just absolutely love fruit. And we get them hanging out all winter because they're eating remnant fruit, usually crab apples that will hang on for months on end. So a bird that, again, very, very common. Everywhere from Alaska, right, to wintering in Florida and breeding anywhere in between. So they're just super, super common. The bluebird, which is also a thrush. Believe it or not, bluebirds are closely related to robins, right? And this male bluebird that you see here has that bright orange chest going down its flanks, and the bright blue of this bird is very, very diagnostic. A bird that in the 1960s and early 70s we thought was on the path to extinction. They had dropped unbelievably to low numbers because of invasive species like European starlings and English house sparrows that are cavity nesters. This bird is a cavity nester, unlike robins and other thrushes. And so they were being kicked out by those birds and unable to reproduce. So that's where people in the 60s and 70s started to put out a lot of bluebird houses to encourage them to have other places to breed. English house sparrows will actually kill bluebirds. They'll destroy their eggs and actually kill the adults. So again, that is a non-native species, where this is a native species that did not evolve with that and really doesn't have a good way of dealing with it. You can see there the female. Again, if you look at these birds and even study their songs, they do have a very strong thrush quality to them. Obviously much smaller than robins, but a bird that when I started birding in the 1980s, you wouldn't see too often in our area, but now are very, very common thanks to humans really helping them sort of rebound from these invasive species that we have. And you can see, again, we're right at the northern edge of their range. Some other ones, this is a song sparrow. Interesting that this bird, you can see, unlike most other birds, the males have to practice this song throughout the fall and winter and early spring to get it down. Most birds have their songs encoded in their DNA, but song sparrows have a template, and young males that are just being hatched right now and into this year will listen to either their father or other males sing, and they will practice that song right into the fall and winter. And you can tell, if you do it long enough, that it's clearly a young male because the song sounds off. Now, if you've ever played the game of telephone, right, you know, over generations, if you have a certain phrase and it gets repeated through generations, it changes. And it does with this particular species, right? So there are local vernaculars of the song sparrow songs that I will hear them in North Carolina here in about a month and go out west and hear them. They sound like a song sparrow, but somehow different, right? And that's that local vernacular because, again, they have to listen and copy it. And there's a little bit of like the game telephone, something changes. So it's almost like our birds say yins and the southern song sparrows say y'all, right? Which, again, that's English, right? But we have different ways that develops here. Widely distributed, very widely distributed here, okay? I'm going to go through this relatively quickly here because we're getting close to the end and I want to leave some time for questions. This is a field sparrow. Again, a bird, whoops, that has as a sparrow very pink bill and legs. And its song sounds like a ping pong ball being dropped on the floor and falling down. But a bird that is declining as the habitat changes here, okay? Here is a swamp sparrow. You find them in swampier areas, excuse me. All right, I wanted to get past the sparrows there. We have a name for those birds, these sort of brown ones that are hard to identify and are all over there. We call them in the bird world little brown jobs because they're often hard for non-birders to identify. But this bird, I think we should adopt this particular species as our bird in Pittsburgh, at least, right? So, because it's black and gold, or at least bright canary yellow. And this is your American goldfinch. Now, this bird is really interesting, and I'm going to pose a question here for you to think about here, but I'm going to tell you about this bird's life history here real quick. The male goldfinches get, and this is a male here, they get this breeding color starting in late March into April, where they molt out of their winter plumage. They look very drab, much more like the female. And then in breeding season, they get this bright canary yellow, right? And you can imagine, right, in wintertime, this bird would stick out like a sore thumb amongst, the lacking of leaves and the gray and everything. But I want you to think about this. Do cardinals, the males, lose that bright red in winter? What about blue jays or bluebirds? Do they lose that blue? The answer is no, they don't. Only the goldfinches will lose this bright yellow. Why do you think that is? I don't know how many of you, if you do know this, but it has everything to do with how birds perceive color. They see on the ultraviolet spectrum, which you and I do not. We see on a different wavelength. So with their cones and rods in their eyes, red in the ultraviolet spectrum appears as a shade, I guess the best way to describe it is certainly like black to a bird, right? Or a shade of black. I know that's not the best analogy, but certainly like that. Where blue appears to birds that see an ultraviolet spectrum as a shade of gray. So in the wintertime, predators like Cooper's hawks and other raptors that would hunt them, they blend in their environment. They don't appear red or blue like you and I perceive it, right? However, hawks and raptors that would hunt a goldfinch see and perceive the color yellow exactly like you and I do. So in the winter, if a goldfinch male had this coloration, a predator would find him easily sticking out like a sore thumb. So when you see those differences, that has everything to do about how birds are able to perceive light and color, right? They can see ultraviolet, you and I cannot. We can only kind of guess what that looks like, but it's an interesting reason why they do that. Here's a female. Again, you can see they're much drabber and not nearly as colorful, right? There's another picture there as well. So very, very different, right? And there's another picture of them in the wintertime, okay? All right, my last couple birds here, and I'm gonna open it to questions here. I have two more I'm gonna show you. These are Cedar Waxwings, a fruit-eating species that you find in Western PA that in the warmer months shifts to eating a lot of insects, a non-sexually dimorphic bird. but the coloration on those birds, if you've ever had the opportunity, like I have to hold one in my hand, it's amazing the subtle contrasts of those colors. Again, one of the few tufted species that we have, but that yellow coming down from that tannish color, and then that bright yellow on their tails, and then you can see on their wing feathers, it looks like they were dipped in red wax, right? Like you used to seal letters back in the 18th century. Just a really gorgeous looking bird, and a bird that for most of the year will eat fruit, right? And will wander quite widely in the search of it. We get them here year round, but you need to have a good supply of fruit for them. Last, but certainly not least, is the northern mockingbird, right? A bird that's in the family, what we call Mimidae, where they mimic. And there's 3 of them that you can find in our area. The mockingbird that you see here, the brown thrasher, and then the catbird. All of them are in the same family, very closely related. All of them are mimics. This bird is the best mimic. Brown thrashers are more rapid fire in their mimicking. Catbirds are not nearly as good. But also, this is a very aggressive bird as well. And you can see when it flies, it has a very distinctive display with its wing feathers, with that white banding on both the edges of its rectrices or tail feathers and underneath it. And a bird that is just perfectly adapted to human alterations of our environment. So tend to find this bird in sitting on light poles in shopping centers or suburban habitats. And another bird that 100 years ago was not found anywhere in Western PA, but now you can find all the way up to Erie because of a warming climate. And you can see again, it is rapidly extending its range further and further north. So with that said, that is just a sort of taste of some of our birds that we have here in our region. There are certainly plenty more, but again, I would always, if I'm going to do a much more detailed account of these bird species, I would have to break them up in your different families, which we tend to do in the birding world, right? Like your shorebirds or your waterfowl or your raptors, both diurnal and nocturnal. But I do want to give you the idea that there is a plethora of diverse bird species surrounding you right now. So if you're in Peters Township or Washington County or near Upper St. Clair or anywhere in our area, there is all sorts of birds that even while you are sleeping are making that journey further north. And just to me, amazes me that how these birds are able to go just vast distances. That a month ago they were hanging out with sloths and jaguars and howler monkeys, right? And now they're here in Western Pennsylvania, right? So I think just an amazing thing to imagine. So that said, 7:57, I'm going to see if you have a question to put in chat here. I can answer these for you here. So Anna Marie asks, why is the European robin larger than European robins? That's a great question, Anna Marie. And they're not even closely related at all, not even anywhere near one another. European robins are very, very different birds. In fact, they're more closely related to chickadees than they are our modern, or I should say our American robins, not modern robins. The people from Europe who called the American robin that were clearly homesick. And they tried to identify a bird that looked anything like something that they were familiar with in this sort of foreign and alien land. But they are not closely related birds at all. In fact, again, a lot of our birds, you often hear mourning doves that we have around here called turtle doves, which we don't have turtle doves, right? But that's just a old world name for a bird species, right? Sydney asked me here, if the reds and blues do not come across as reds and blues, then why is it more advantageous for the female cardinal to mate with a redder male cardinal? Excellent question. And again, the female is able to, Sydney, to perceive what we see as red in a different shade. It's much more subtle, right? So in individuals, and this is hard, there's a real philosophical problem in this. It's called the problem of other minds. It's hard for us to imagine what it's like to be a dog, let alone a cardinal, right? And so, but somehow in that contrast, however she perceives it, there will be something about that plumage that appears attractive to her. We just perceive it as human beings as red. And that has to do with the carotenoids that are in their diet, right? And it tends to be that females like the males that have more carotenoids. However, that color appears to her as a shade of black. it means he has a richer diet somehow in there. So it's just a interesting thing. And again, ultraviolet and how they perceive light on that spectrum is very, very different. So it is 7:59. Thank you, Sydney. Does anybody have, in the last minute I have here, any other questions or comments you'd like me to answer? As they say, the silence is deafening. So I'm assuming that that is it. Thank you very much, Carrie. So with that said, I want to thank you all for coming out on a Monday night and listening to me talk about birds. And certainly this is just scratching the tip of the iceberg. Mary, I think you have, Mary Volkart, I think you have a question, or you just, you putting your hand up there?
No, I'm just giving you a thumbs up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Well, like I said, this is just scratching the surface, right? It's an introductory thing. So like any subject matter, if you're interested, there's tons of fascinating things to learn about birds that we just really even just started with. So yes, you can call me, Joan, anytime at Audubon. I'm at Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve. You can ask for me, and I'm always answering questions about birds. So with that said, I hope you all have a wonderful Monday evening, and thank you, Sydney and Linda and everybody for having me on, and I hopefully will see you all sometime in the future.
Thank you so much for being with us this evening, Chris, and have a great evening. If anyone needs anything from the library, I'm going to stay on for a few minutes, but otherwise, thank you all for spending some time with us on this lovely Monday evening.
Okay. Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you.